Again, this is another sign of the times, an analysis, and a commentary. Wasted lessons from Afghanistan, America's longest war. So then, what emerges from a trove of documents obtained by the Washington Post outlining the abject failure of the war in Afghanistan and the decades of lies told about it is the inescapable notion that the American government refuses to be honest with itself. For years, military and civilian leaders said that the mission to rebuild Afghanistan was not only possible, but succeeding. Yet in private, the men and women who ran the war acknowledged to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction what has long been clear to all but the most blinkered observers. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing, said an Army general who served in the Obama and Bush administrations during a 2015 interview with the Inspector General. The dim prospects of achieving anything that could be called victory were evident almost immediately after the Taliban was toppled from power in 2002. We are never going to get the U.S. military out of Afghanistan unless we take care to see that there is something going on that will provide the stability that will be necessary for us to leave. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, wrote in a memo in the spring of 2002, which was cited in the Post report. Mr. Rumsfeld ended with a plea, "Help." More than a year later, Mr. Rumsfeld, the man in charge of the most well-resourced military on the planet, was blunt. After more than $1 trillion spent in 18 years of fighting, the government in Kabul is still not stable enough to function without the backing of American troops. There is little evidence to suggest that it ever will be. Again, there is little evidence to suggest that it ever will be. That's nice to know. The time frame for creating a strong central government is 100 years, which we didn't have, an unidentified former State Department official told investigators in 2015. But to admit that the goal is unattainable is to admit failure. So the myth-making continues. Institutional inertia persists, and the Pentagon keeps issuing deployment orders to maintain a 13,000-person presence in the country. Victory on the battlefield will always belong to you, the American warrior. President Trump assured a uniformed crowd at Bagram Airfield last month. An unidentified former member of the National Security Council staff was more explicit about the real marching orders. Your job was not to win, it was not to lose, the staffer told an interviewer in 2014, according to the documents. It has been a long and bloody stalemate since the war began. More than 2,400 Americans have been killed and more than 20,000 wounded. More than 38,000 Afghan civilians have died, with countless more injured. The Taliban now controls much of the country, which is awash with refugees, and opium production has quadrupled. Mr. Trump's administration has been in talks with the Taliban to bring the conflict to an end. In September, the Air Force dropped more bombs and other munitions in Afghanistan than in any other month in nearly a decade. Civilian casualties are appallingly high. America's failure in Afghanistan may come as a surprise to some Americans, but the Americans who should not be at all surprised are the members of Congress who voted to launch the war, repeatedly voted to continue funding it, and have been absent without leave in their duty to oversee its progress. This is truly shocking. Years and years of half-truths and outright falsehoods. said a senator from Missouri in a tweet about the documents. The senator is a member of the Armed Services Committee. It is deeply troubling to read a report of interviews with U.S. government officials that appear to contradict the many assurances we have heard at committee hearings that the continuing war in Afghanistan has a coherent strategy and an end in sight. Kirsten Gillibrand, a senator from New York, wrote in a letter to the head of the Armed Services Committee, of which she is a member. It is both truly shocking and deeply troubling that members of Congress who oversee the military and are privy to classified assessments like those published by the Post were surprised by the revelations in the documents, which took 3 years and 2 federal lawsuits to pry loose for public consumption. The Inspector General conducted the interviews between 2014 and 2018 with military and civilian officials who oversaw the war as part of a series of reports called Lessons Learned. There have been many lessons to draw from the war in Afghanistan: the corrosive effects of corruption, the lack of strategy and accountability, civilian deference to assurances from military leaders, and seductive idea that the United States, and not the Afghans, was in control of what was happening in the country, but there's little evidence that the American government has learned them. And as long as the military and civilian leadership overseeing the war in Afghanistan keep insisting that their strategies are working, there's little hope they ever will. Again, that's nice to know. Yes, it's still about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations? And that should be a very important question to ask. Revelation chapter 16. And I heard a loud voice out of the sanctuary say to the 7 angels, "Go and pour out the 7 bowls of the anger of God on the earth." The first one went off and poured out his bowl on the earth, and a hurtful and malignant ulcer afflicted the people who had the mark of the wild beast and who were worshipping its image. The second one poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood like that of a dead man, and every living creature died, yes, the things in the sea. The third one poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became as blood. I heard the angel over the waters say, "You, the one who is and who was, the loyal one, are righteous, for you have issued these judgments, because they poured out the blood of holy ones and of prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it." And I heard the altar say, "Yes, Jehovah, God the Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments." The fourth one poured out his bowl on the sun, and to the sun it was granted to scorch the people with fire. And the people were scorched by the great heat, but they blasphemed the name of God, who has the authority over these plagues, and they did not repent and give glory to him. The fifth one poured out his bowl on the throne of the wild beast, and its kingdom or nation became darkened. They began to gnaw their tongues because of their pain. But they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their ulcers, and they did not repent of their works. The sixth one poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings and leaders from the rising of the sun. And I saw 3 unclean inspired expressions that looked like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the wild beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are, in fact, expressions inspired by demons, and they perform signs, and they go out to the kings and leaders of the entire inhabited earth to gather them together to the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Look, I am coming as a thief. Happy is the one who stays awake and keeps his outer garments, so that he may not walk naked, and people look upon his shamefulness, and they gather them together to the place that is called in Hebrew Armageddon. The seventh one poured out his bowl on the air. At this a loud voice came out of the sanctuary from the throne, saying, "It is come to pass." And there were flashes of lightning, and voices, and thunders, and there was a great earthquake, unlike any that had occurred since humans came to be on the earth. So extensive and so great was the earthquake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and Babylon the Great was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. Also every island or nation fled, and mountains were not found. Then great hailstones, each about the weight of a talent, fell from heaven on the people, and the people blasphemed God because of the plague of hail, for the plague was unusually great. Again, it's time for the spiritual and physical manifestation of the book of Revelation, and all these are more signs. Again, it's still about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations, and that should be a very important question to ask